There can be a deep sense of displacement in the experience of the diaspora, often raised unrooted to ancestral lands and traditions, or even fully rudderless in the vacuum of cultural assimilation. To engage in ancestral lifeways from this position can sometimes give off a palpable sense of imposter syndrome, seeming like a choice between appropriation and a LARP. How can we explore ancestral spirituality as ancestors in training rather than merely venerating the past? How can ancient myths make us more engaged in our present? The Pennsylvania Dutch and their many iterations offer a fascinating example of how a diasporic people can foster a living spirituality, propelled by their traditions, but gracefully in conversation with the adaptations and assimilations that a true connection to the present moment asks of us. The Pennsylvania Dutch have many flavors, but the most interesting to me is somehow at once the most invested in their ancestral ontology and also the most progressive. Urglaawe is a new vision for working with old gods, a strain of heathenry that seeks to adapt ancient wisdom to contemporary life and root ancestral lifeways in new lands. Robert Schreiwer, Michelle Jones, and Stacey Lynne Stewart, welcome to Radical Elf Fam. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting us.
I'm stoked to have you here. I just finished your book, Heathen Traditions of the Pennsylvania Dutch, which was super fascinating. I was kind of telling you before I hit the record button how I was a little familiar with aspects of Pennsylvania Dutch kind of history and culture, but more on that like syncretic dual faith side and less of the kind of more like heathen pagan elements. So that was really cool to see illustrated so clearly and in depth. So I'm excited to dive into all that today. But just to kick things off, go round robin here and give a quick intro about yourselves and then maybe just a little bit about how you got into magic.
I'll go
Whoever
last.
wants to go first.
I'll go first. I actually
Perfect.
picked up my first, oh my gosh, I have it next. This was my first book. Modern Witch's Spellbook by Sarah Lynne Mortis. That was my first book that I picked up in 1985 when I worked at a bookstore. I was 16. So I actually got into magic and tarot before I got into paganism and heathenry and Wicca or any of the other things I've practiced. So it was early on, but it was just magic at that point, and it's changed a lot, obviously, in 40 years.
Yeah.
So I got into magic. I mean, I don't know how specific you want to get as far as like our backgrounds. If you just want to talk about magic or, our involvement with Urglaawe, but magic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, anywhere you want to go.
All right. So specifically involved with magic, I actually grew up in a Protestant faith called the United Church of Christ, which is endemic to the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. You don't find it too much outside of areas where the Pennsylvania Dutch live. It is actually a descendant or evolution of the German Reformed Church. It was also considered to be one of the more liberal Protestant faiths, one of the first to allow female pastors, etc. The church I grew up in, we had a sacred dance troupe, which was actually kind of cool. And I got involved in that. And I remember, and I'm telling the story because it's sort of my first foray into something that was not what you would deem typical Christian practice. But we used to do meditations before the sacred dance practices. And I can remember even then, like going deeper into that stuff. And I was already sort of interested in esoteric type studies and like things that, didn't have specific answers in the Bible or that were taught in church. So I was always kind of doing exploring on my own. And I always felt, you always see these memes that say, I felt a closer connection to spirit in the woods than I ever did in a church. And that was always how I felt. And I can remember, going on Girl Scout camping trips or going on church outings and being in the woods and just feeling the sense of this is where I belong as far as like places. So I always kind of delved into that. And then I started hearing about, I'm a history nerd, so I started reading and hearing about these apocryphal texts that didn't make it into the Bible. So I really started reading up on that and like, well, why wasn't it? And you know, where are they? So I started getting into all of that and actually started considering myself more a Gnostic than a Protestant UCC member. Um, and then through Gnosticism, I started the path on the sacred feminine, and from there just kind of went through, but also all the while recognizing that energy was something tangible and it wasn't just, another thing out there. Um, and knowing that, if that you can actually manifest things using energy. And I think for me, I'm also an engineer by training, so it's sort of like the science background meets the spiritual background, and the two things merged for me. And understanding that like what people considered magic in historical times was really just science. So, like to me, like I just find this really all intertwined and interesting. So, I don't know, like I don't know that there was any one particular point where it was like I'm practicing magic now. It was just sort of like always something that was of interest and like I dabbled in. Um, but as far as like saying I left the Christian faith and converted to paganism, and considered myself a full-on witch, that was probably the early aughts. Um, so I guess that's sort of my backstory as far as being a practicing pagan and witch.
Yeah, that's really cool having that sense of magic that kind of transcends the title of Christian or pagan or witch, like to me, that's a really holistic approach to a topic that I feel like a lot of us, it's really hard to even try to believe in it, starting out, growing up in like the quote unquote West. So that's cool that you had that perspective, even a young person being a Christian. That's really cool.
Okay, so I'm gonna throw the whole ball of wax here too. Spending most of my life with one foot in the plain Pennsylvania culture, Mennonites, and the descendant Mennonite brethren on the one side, and then the other foot in the Lutheran uh, part of the culture. So both fancy Dutch and plain Dutch. Um, there was even within, I would say, the plainer communities where magic is not really supposed to be a thing. It's still a thing in a lot of ways. And but definitely within the fancy part of the culture, the line between magic and just ordinary living is very blurry, if present at all. I mean, I have practitioners of Brauchrai in my lineage, of like my literal lineage, and my mother was always capable of doing things and knew some of the charms and things like that. As I was growing up, went to both medical doctors and to Brauchers, and so for me that line is very blurry. I don't think there ever was a distinct line that I ever would have said is where I crossing it until I actually perhaps when I entered the Braucherei training myself. That being said, though, I've always known some Brauerei growing up because it was just endemic to our culture. And the more traditional you were, and particularly among the fancy Dutch, the more you came across it. But even if the watered down versions turned up in the plainer versions, but so for me, there's definitely a much the line is really blurry between like ever having a distinction where I wasn't practicing magic versus where I was practicing magic. Now I'd say it's a lot clearer because I've evolved, not necessarily because of any particular change, but I've evolved to be able to make the distinctions. Now we've given ourselves the language use to describe our own experiences growing up, which we'll probably get into at some point later, is how we had to adjust how adjusting our language, our understanding of the use of language helped to clarify a lot of these things. So I think did I answer the question? I hope so.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Just, well, you know what? No, I'll do the first question, then you can kind of go into it probably. So the first question, just to prime people, maybe that haven't read this book yet, who are the Pennsylvania Dutch in a
Okay.
broad sense?
Yeah,
Brock.
I guess I'll field that one. So the Pennsylvania Dutch, that term always confused people to the point where people wanted to throw the term out and replace it with Pennsylvania German. And the problem is that both terms are wrong and both terms are right. First off, it is the word Dutch. It is English. In English, the word Dutch changed meaning. In English, Dutch used to mean a much broader swath of territory from the Netherlands all the way into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so when our ancestors migrated over here from Germanic-speaking lands, they were still called Dutch, but not necessarily because of the Netherlands. It was because that was the word for all the Germanic peoples in that swath of territory. It is the cognate of Deutsch and Deutsch. It's the English cognate of them. So Pennsylvania Dutch is actually is a term is using Dutch in its older sense. And
And keep in mind
and
too, when our ancestors immigrated here, Germany wasn't even a country yet. So
Right.
that's something
and
that people need to understand.
yes,
What was
and
Yeah.
Germany
also
called then?
They
uh,
were all just little duchies that were
it
ruled
was a
over.
Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah,
I
basically.
did not know that. That's wild.
Yeah.
And
Huh.
it was a Holy Roman Empire, but the Netherlands, became independent shortly before the departure happened, and the Netherlands, that was the ports from which most of our ancestors departed continental Europe, and so they were arriving in England on Dutch ships, and then the Dutch ships were not allowed to go directly to the colonies, so they had to change ships over in England. So they were already coming on Dutch ships, so that confusion would have even added to it. When they came to Philadelphia, they were mostly called Palatines, whether they were from the Palatinate or not. The Palatinate is the region of Germany by the Rhineland faults today, um, from which the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect gets its pedigree. But Pennsylvania Dutch is unique. It is, of course, now my cats decide to have a little cat spat.
We encourage the natural sound of animals scurrying about on the
Yeah, I'm
show.
not
It's
playing this
beautiful.
part. They're not startling easily either. Sorry about that. But and like I was saying to Stacey, watch the cat will come up behind me and throw up on the couch like happened one time before. But anyway, and so they were being called Palatines. And Benjamin Franklin had some pretty nasty things to say about our forebears there.
Hmm.
Uh, Many of the things that we hear people saying today about other people who are, you know, immigrants and that who can't adopt our language and customs because their skin's not our color. We were not white. We were swarthy, and we could never adopt their customs any more than we could adopt the color of their skin. So the Germans were not white enough for Benjamin Franklin, nor were the Swedes or the French or anybody. It's kind of the Swedes in particular I find funny, um, but so the Pennsylvania Dutch consist of immigrants from various German lands, not just the Rhineland. Switzerland makes up a huge chunk. Much of my family is of Swiss origin, and also the French Huguenots are mixed in there, as are some Romani people, otherwise formerly known as the Gypsies, which was going. A lot of people might not know that term, but I'm not going to use that word again. But just to get the point across. But and peoples from all the Germanic lands, including Transylvania and modern day Romania. So they all ended up coming here. Philadelphia was the primary port. Baltimore was the secondary port. New York was also there, and surprisingly enough, also New Orleans. And some people who are considered Pennsylvania Dutch never had an ancestor who set foot in Pennsylvania, but it was all from the same migration. And they went to different places, stayed in different places. While our ancestors were coming west, the Volga Germans' ancestors were going east. So the Volga Germans, I've actually helped resettle the descendants of Volga Germans at the collapse of the Soviet Union. They came over here, and the elderly among them were still speaking a Swabian dialect that was like about 80% mutually intelligible to Pennsylvania Dutch. And the 80%, it was like far more easy for us to understand each other than it was for either one of us to understand modern High German. So, uh, Pennsylvania Dutch is actually a very large ethnic group, especially when combined with German American. It's the largest in the country, but most people don't recognize Pennsylvania Dutch by itself is smaller, but it's still a large ethnic group. Many people don't even know that they have Pennsylvania Dutch ancestry. If their ancestors came to the colonies anytime between like 1683 or before, because there are some that came before, up until roughly the Napoleonic Wars, they're not German American. Those ancestors are Pennsylvania Dutch, and so it's
And
a
I
much
found mine. I had no idea until I started looking into my biological father's side of the family, which is where I get my indigenous Mexican and Puerto Rican roots. So I wasn't looking there for Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch, and that's where I found it though. And I had family that came both to Philadelphia and to Baltimore. And some of them were from the Palatinate, some were from Alsace-Lorraine area, which wasn't part of France at the
another
time.
another battleground. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had family actually in the Netherlands. So I had no idea though. So it was very, it made a lot make sense to me when I finally figured things out.
But one thing I want to underscore is that one need not be Pennsylvania Dutch, have any Pennsylvania Dutch extraction. We're not about that. And
Hmm.
this is where
And
the culture from which the culture from which this system has arisen, and that's why it's important. But I don't care. There are some wonderful people out there who have not a lick of Pennsylvania Dutch background and they make the best Urglaawe. And there's a lot of people out there who are Pennsylvania Dutch extraction who, in my opinion, might not be so great, adherents to religion because they don't have the basic concepts of what heathenry or paganism should be.
right.
Michelle.
And one of the other clarifications I want to make, I mean, that's very important what Rob said, but I also want to clarify because there's a big confusion a lot of times when we're talking about what are the Pennsylvania Dutch. It's sort of like a Venn diagram. All Amish are
Hmm.
Pennsylvania Dutch, but not all Pennsylvania Dutch are Amish, and I think that's important for people to understand. Rob mentioned earlier the plain and the fancy Dutch. So as Rob mentioned, he grew up with one foot in the plain and foot in the fancy. The plain are like the sectarian faith, so the Amish, the Mennonites, the Brethren, any of the Anabaptist faiths. The fancies are the more secular groups of the Pennsylvania Dutch. A lot of them are Lutheran, UCC, German Reformed. There are a handful of Catholic Pennsylvania Dutch, although that is, I would say, the minority.
I
And
would
then
put
you
the
have,
Moravians in,
and
the
then,
Moravian
Mm.
yeah,
and the semi-plane. I would put the Schwenkfelders in with the semi-plane.
okay. And then, of course, you also have country Dutch and you have city Dutch. So I grew up city Pennsylvania fancy Dutch. So, there's those distinctions even among the Pennsylvania Dutch, but I always like to make sure that people understand that when we say Pennsylvania Dutch, we're not specifically talking about Amish people.
So, do you guys actually call yourselves fancy Dutch? Like, that's common parlance?
It used to be gay Dutch, but
Yeah.
then,
Really?
Yep.
well, because gay in its more classic sense, uh, because the stricter sex were the more obvious to most people. But I refer to myself as semi-plain actually because I still dress culturally in the way I'm used to wearing, and
Interesting.
and some Stacey sometimes dons the covering and things like that. So some of us kind of go back and forth. There is no requirement that anybody dresses in any particular style, but some of us do feel a call to to wear some elements of the traditional style as an outward identifier. But there's no rule on that. So you'll see the gamut of it.
And I don't. I mean, I don't actively, I don't call myself fancy, but if somebody asks what my background is, I will say that that's just to make it clear, I guess, or for it to make more sense. Um, but yeah, there's still restaurants up in Pennsylvania Dutch country called Plain and Fancy, and a lot of people don't understand where that comes from, and it's because it was catering to both of those groups of Pennsylvania Dutch people. So
And to be
That's
fair, one person in
fascinating.
our community has started a little clothing line that she calls the new fancy Dutch, style. So
That's so interesting. I love that. If I could call myself fancy something, I know I would. That's just too good.
yeah, I mean, I think the easy designation is that the fancy Dutch are more assimilated into modern culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, how we dress, you wouldn't notice the difference.
Yeah.
but
That's
but there
interesting.
used to be a fancy Dutch that was noticeable, and there's still some people who
Mm.
dress like that. They dress
Hmm.
in similar styles to the plane. But the thing, and this is what we're trying to actually get done. We're trying to fancify some of our clothing for rituals in particular, because like embroidery can be sacred. Fiber arts work can be sacred, and so trying to incorporate those things into our rituals is of high importance to us. And we have a few people out there who are who are working on that. Stacey is one of the people who has the hopes with the embroidery. We've actually undertaken some stuff with embroidery, especially with hats, but not. No, we haven't gotten quite as far with that as we want, mostly because I don't know how to embroider.
That's awesome. I love that. It's yeah, I don't know. I like the extent of the aesthetic aspect of it. That's so cool. I like I was saying when we kind of started out the show, I have some notions about Pennsylvania Dutch before I read your book, and it's these kind of three folk strains that you hear come up now and again: powwow, braucherei, and hexerei. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
You are
Yes, you
you're pretty
did.
close. You're close
Nice.
to the most. Well, first off, I mean, I'm gonna let Michelle get into some of the more distinctions, but
Okay.
I'm gonna point out the linguistic distinctions. Um, we avoid the word powwow like the plague within Urglaawe if we can possibly do it, because that word, well, you'll usually see citations saying that it's taken from Algonquian languages, but the Algonquian language that it would have to come from would have been Narragansett. And because the Lenape language for the word for their religious rituals and stuff is not, or spiritual rituals is not that same word, even though Narragansett and Lenape are related to each other. Um, so my firm belief is that the English weren't stupid either. Like they are. I think that they could look at what we were doing and not confuse that with what the Native Americans were doing. There's often this sense that like our ancestors were dumb and they didn't know what their names were. They didn't know, like, they didn't know what they were called. Things like that. My belief is that if anything, it's more likely that it comes from the British mishearing of the word power spoken with the Pennsylvania Dutch language. He
Huh.
has powwow, and
Oh,
that's how,
interesting.
and so that's it could be the Narragansett thing, but that's kind of a stretch, I think. And so Braucherei and Hexerei, I'll let Michelle get into more distinctions there. They both fall under another category called Zauberei, which is magic, but we don't really use that term all that much because uh, Braucherei and Hexerei have distinctions within them. I'm going to allow Michelle to talk about that while I take care of something with my cat here.
Yeah. So, you know, we want to talk about Braucherei and Hexerei in the context of Urglaawe because they are from which we pull a lot of our lore. They are the vehicles by which the pre-Christian understandings and beliefs came and survived. But Urglaawe and Braucherei and Hexerei are two different things. Urglaawe is the religion. Braucherei and Hexerei are the folk magic practices. Braucherei and Hexerei can be practiced within the context of any faith, and you'll find Christian practitioners, you'll find Wiccan practitioners, obviously you'll find Urglaawe practitioners. Um, and Urglaawe, on the flip side, is strictly Urglaawe, and it is the faith and religious practice where we honor and observe the pre-Christian beliefs of the Pennsylvania Dutch. I like to make that distinction because there has been in the past people who have come to Urglaawe thinking that it meant automatically a pathway to becoming a Braucher or Hexer or Hex, and that is
Mm.
not the case. You can practice Braucher. I mean, you can practice the Urglaawe faith without ever practicing Braucherei or Hexerei, and vice versa. So while we talk about Braucherei and Hexerei a lot, because that's where we gleaned a lot of the information in order to formalize and form the Urglaawe faith, it is not necessarily something that we practice within the context of our religious rituals. So, and that being said, however, anybody who is interested in Braucherei and Hexerei, we always get the question, well, what's the difference between the two? And in, the Christian mindset of a dualistic perspective, one is good, one is bad. And even within Pennsylvania Dutch country, the county that Rob and I grew up in, there was a very specific distinction that Braucherei was good, Hexerei was bad, and Hexerei specifically is translated as witchcraft. So you had that distinction. Other places in Pennsylvania Dutch country, they use the terms interchangeably, or they use one term to mean both things. Because we as Urglaawe, we don't have that dualistic mindset. We've taken it upon ourselves as Urglaawe practitioners of Braucherei and Hexerei to define those terms for our workings. So we look at Braucherei as the outward and expansive practice. A lot of times doing good for the community, but usually it involves a lot of like the healing practices and it involves sympathetic magic and energetic healing and all of those things too. But that is what you would see as the outward expression of the practice, where it's public and everybody knows about it. Hexerei, however, is the more inward and immersive practice or perspective of the practice. It is where you kind of dive deep into yourself and you learn about all of those things and how they contribute to your own evolution in the cosmos. That practice also uses sympathetic magic, also uses healing practices, also uses energetic healing. But like I said, I would say like the Hexerei practice is more a personal practice, where the Braucherei is more of a public practice.
I view it like a spectrum.
Yeah.
Like a spectrum, like, depending on what you're doing, because like, there are certainly times where the community of us has to, gets together and shares Hexerei things. We have a couple of rather hexic holidays, hexic, by the way, we use the word hexic because, a lot of the word shamanism has entered English parlance through German, by the way, but it's being used in a way that kind of appropriates from the Evenki and related cultures in Siberia. And we
Mhm.
have our own practices that are similar to that, but since it's within our own cultural context, if, rather than saying shamanic, we say hexic or brauchig, but usually hexic.
So yeah, you mentioned that Urglaawe is the religious aspect of these practices, looking to kind of prior to Christian conversion, so more of a heathen perspective. Where did this term come from? Is this an ancient term? Is this a modern term to describe
I'll,
this
I'll
ancient
field,
practice?
yeah, I'll field this one. I
Yeah.
don't want to say it's the religious aspect of these practices. I want to say it's
Okay.
distinct from these practices, but it
Mm.
draws from these practices, and within
Hmm.
our context, Urglaawe informs how we do the practices, and the practices inform us how Urglaawe might have been practiced and can be practiced and could be practiced now. Or the term Urglaawe is a neologism dating from 2007, um, because here's the story. So, Urglaawe Foundation story, not to be confused with creation. Um,
Yeah.
all right, so, like I said, I grew up with one foot in the plain and one foot in the fancy culture, and, I've always known about Braucherei because, I've been seeing my share of powwows over the years, and, um, and I've always known it. I've always known it in its animistic forms where, I used to work in IT, and I used to treat each computer that I had to deal with as an individual with its individual spirits, and I would do what I called techno Braucherei, where I would try to heal the computers energetically, which sounds completely absurd, but sometimes it actually seemed to work because it's still electrical impulses. But the and so somewhere along the way, like, I always consider myself a good Mennonite man, with Brethren leanings. I went to a Brethren college, but and with also the Lutheran influence from my mom, but the eventually, I kept hearing what I kept recognizing as multiple Ds. Everybody in my family knows that some people in my family have the abilities that they try to hide. Like my mother can see auras, and she would always try not to talk about it. My sister, this stuff happened, but not that Braucherei and Hexerei are inherited because they're not. It's just the culture actually builds these things around people so you can actually just by being part of the culture you might be more attuned to some of this stuff if you're tuned into the culture recognizes that these things exist, so I think you're more likely to see them based on the cultural experience. But um but I recognized that I was hearing the call of multiple deities, and and I was always curious about it, but I finally in 2007, um, my partner and I were down in Florida at my parents. You know, uh, they have a house, had a house down in Naples, and I finally decided, "Oh, I'm gonna research this." And so, I talked to my partner, we found the only bookstore around Naples, Florida that we could go to, and came home with a book. I gotta find that book, it's here somewhere. Um, a book that is roughly like the equivalent of Hinduism for dummies, because Hinduism was like the only religion that I knew of that had multiple deities. And, that wasn't the actual title of the book, but it was something like that. It's like very basic Hinduism. As I'm reading through it, the author of the book was of Norwegian descent, and so she mentioned Asatru in her
Mm.
narration, and so I was like, "Let me look into that." So I looked that one up, and I ordered a copy of Diana Paxson's, Essential Asatru. I joined the Troth, and I joined the AFA, not knowing the AFA's background at the time. When I got home, the book was here, and so I started reading the book. As I'm reading the book, and that's when all of a sudden, like the brick ton fell on my head. Oh my gosh, those helpful entities in Braucherei that they sometimes call to for assistance, they're the old gods. They're the old goddesses. Some of the things, some of the stories and stuff, like not recognizing all these years, but then comes what I call the mind shift. The mind shift is when you start seeing your history of your life in the context as a heathen rather than as a Christian, and you see the things that have been talking to you for all that time, things that you didn't realize when you were growing up, something that somebody said or a superstition or a legend or something, all of a sudden make a whole different sense to you as from a heathen perspective. Um, that is one important thing that I focus on myself with people. It's like let the mind shift happen, because without the mind shift, and I gotta find a better phrase for this. You're essentially a Christian dry drunk, a Christian in heathen trappings. That, but you need to let that. And I take joy. I still occasionally, every now and again, get the Again, I gotta find a better term than dry drunk, 'cause that term's kind of offensive, but it gets the point across best. But the but the I still sometimes have those moments where all of a sudden, like a little eureka moment of the mind shift. And I take joy in that, because it means that there's still a lot of stuff I'm learning about myself and about the world around me. Like, it is for as long as I've been an Urglaawe, um, which I still have to explain where that term came from. Um, it I still am learning a lot from it, and I like watching other people experience that when they, "Oh, that's what my grandfather meant when he said," you know, or like, "That's what, so now I know who the old man is snoring, who was snoring when it was raining and pouring," things like that. It's like you start seeing just how much heathen or pagan essence is still left within the culture that has been buried, but not killed off by the larger Christian hegemony. So in November of 2007, after I was found in a German Erminenschaft group, still not learning my way, I was still shocked to find out that they were racist people. I had no idea
Mm.
that people would ever use this religion for, like, for racist or exclusionary purposes, because I thought, didn't we fight a war about that? But, I won the war, but, and, but we were talking about it on the Hexakunst Yahoo group, which Patricia Niedrich, who I consider to be the co-founder of Urglaawe by name, um, she had brought me into that group, and we began right away. That's where my Braucherei mentor was. That's where my herbalism mentor ended up. Yeah, I ended up finding this whole community there, and, we up until that point, I had been considering, well, how can we roll this in with Asatru to get a wider Germanic perspective, rather than just the Norse? Because Asatru and Orglova do have a lot of things in common, but there are some salient differences. And one of the biggest salient differences that we have a lot of this stuff in our own living culture, and
Mhm.
so they have a lot of stuff that like their system and our system, they have an affinity to one another. We can be in the same ritual and everything, but they're not the same. And 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 so I trying to figure out what the name would be. Well, Patricia suggested, well, a lot of times many religions, reconstructionists or old religions use something like original faith, our old faith, and that's where Urglaawe came from. The
Mhm.
the ur prefix is the cognative of the English your, yore, and glava uh means faith or religion. So it's the religion of your, the ancient religion. And that's how it came into being. Ta-da!
That's fascinating. It's so cool. There's probably other examples, but I can't think of that many examples of spiritualities in the United States that really merge like their diaspora with old religion in such like a visceral way, like if you're interested in pagan spirituality from like Ireland or something, it never quite feels of where you live in the United States. It always feels like this thing you're trying to connect to from the past. So that's very cool that you get to experience that.
Well, this is one of those things that I don't think that many Pennsylvania Dutch people necessarily appreciated growing up or understood. Like, and Michelle can probably back me up on this, but like we just always thought that this was the way things were, and because our we were among the first. Our ancestors, our forebears, arrived here on these shores as refugees, not as colonists, and we came here en masse as refugees of the 30 Years' War, and we've had a much different relationship with the Native Americans and settled the frontier peaceably. If we had a good lawyer, we could probably make a case that there should be independent Pennsylvania Dutch territory after the Susquehannock abandoned their land and moved up, and split up. But I don't think a lawyer wants to cover that. But I'd be willing to give it a shot. Um, the but and so there became like a distinct Pennsylvania Dutch country, which we call Diaspora, and it's not contiguous. It's in Pennsylvania, it's in Ohio, it's in Wisconsin, it's in Ontario, it's in many states, many countries throughout North America, and even into South America because the migration of Mennonites went everywhere, and um and so it's but this distinct regional culture, it's kind of I think the only like the other people could probably have a similar relationship to the land over this many centuries might be the Cajuns, um,
Mhm.
where there's like kind of a distinct homeland still, and the Native Americans, of course, who have they have claimed everything, but uh, but I think that gives us somewhat that this has become our homeland, and and uh and not that we can't share it with everybody else. It's like our homeland. It's the homeland that gave rise to our culture, and the cultures that allowed us to get here. The Netherlands, Dutch helping us get out of Europe, the English helping us get here, and the Native Americans, and the Lenape specifically, forming a bond together and actually living side by side for many decades until the French and Indian War, caused some conflict with the English there, which resulted in the Lenape getting removed from the region for the most part. They're still here, and many of them are Pennsylvania Dutch and Lenape mix.
Hmm, that's wild. You kind of touched on it, but just in case there's any more threads to pull, what are some of the distinctions between Urglaawe and a more reconstructionist-based heathenry, besides just the Pennsylvania Dutch influence? Is there any other distinctions?
Yeah, I don't want to hog the. I'm just going to throw out the main topic, and I'll let the others elaborate too. We're not really trying to reconstruct much because we
Hmm.
already have a lot. So what I
Uh-huh.
used to call this like deconstructionist. What
Hmm.
happened early on in our in the research process was finding like identifying things in the culture and then stripping away the things that were clearly not of heathen origin, and and then reviving. So revivalist, I think, might be the term that more people would use, reviving the heathen core that was like
And beyond reviving, we're not just looking to have
to a trajectory.
revived.
Yeah.
We want to continue and build on. We live the religion. We don't reconstruct. We didn't reconstruct it, make it that way, and that's how it's going to be practiced forever. We look for changes. We want input. We want new lessons, and we want new experiences. And if you have it, reconstructionism absolutely has its place, and for some people that's what they need. But for me, I like that we have more of an eye on the future and how we can build something that someone else can build on later and keep it current. We need to be able to practice our religion here and now. And if there's such a disconnect with your religion that you can't do that, then it might not be working as well as you think, you
I
know?
think I think that all heathen paths are on are at the point where they're beginning to develop their own trajectories now, and which is good. Um, Yeah, like our elevator speech is Urglaawe is a modern iteration of the ancient Germanic religion as seen through the lens of the living Pennsylvania Dutch culture. That's kind of describes that. I'll let everybody else talk.
I already talked.
No, I mean, we talk about it all the time, and you said it. I mean, this is a living tradition, and we joke all the time about I like my indoor plumbing, and embrace all of those things that are meant for modern life. And
Come on,
apply.
Michelle, you like the corn cobs in the outhouse. Come on.
She wouldn't go to the bathroom all winter.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a problem. Um, but I'm not a winter girl, so um, the yeah. So we just feel like as society progresses, we need to be able to apply our religious beliefs to that, and vice versa. Um, like Stacey said, if your religion can't be practiced within the context of your modern life, then it's not going to fulfill you. Um, so it's important to understand that, as we look to the past for information, that we continue to contribute to the religion today and for the future.
And that goes for everyone. We are the storytellers of tomorrow. We are telling the stories that will be told 100 years from now, 200 years from now. What are we giving people to read back to their ancestors or their younger generations going forward?
Yeah, it's very heartening to see this type of approach to these subjects happening more and more. Just, I feel like in the past, if you went back in time, even just like 20 or 30 years, it would feel so much like you're LARPing, getting engaged with like paganism and heathenry and this sort of thing. Whereas this just feels so authentic and alive in a lot of ways that it's very exciting to see. Yeah. So dipping our toe into the cosmology of Urglaawe, um, which I do want to go into more in depth in our Patreon segment when we kind of look at the world tree aspect. But just kind of starting off, what is the role of the concept of Vert and Erlig, might be pronouncing these wrong, in your practice?
Vort and Orleg.
Okay.
Um, so I'm going to put this away. I've heard other heathens separate the difference between Urlog and weird.
Mm-hmm.
Orleg is kind of the hand you're dealt at birth, and Vort is how you play it. But
Yeah.
but I think that's kind of it kind of helped get the point across, but it's a little bit different. Um, because most Urglaawe believe in at least a partial soul rebirth. It's that part of us comes back for lifetime after lifetime to take what it learned, even though we don't come into this life being conscious of it in prior lives, and to help to rebuild, help to advance the human life wave, now, and with what we know. And so, Orleg is what that soul construct brings in from the last several lives. It's the primal layers, the things that you bring with you. Much of it can, and some of it's genetic based, but a lot of it is based on what the deeds done in prior lives. This is probably one of the sketchier parts of our lore, because soul lore is still something that's being explored, but that's similar to the understandings that many other heathens group have as well. But then the Vort are weird. We use the Anglo-Saxon term. Vort is what you do with your Vort is that's how you live your life now. It's kind of similar to karma, but it's there, but it's kind of similar to fate, but it's not. Fate is not predestined. It's more similar to karma. But the one of the differences for me personally is that Vort is also I see Vort as being a force that kind of like It's like I look at it as a maker God that actually set things into motion, and proto-conscious or unconscious or conscious, it that everything that even the gods and goddesses are subject to this force. I believe that it made some of the first deities, and then they began to propagate on their own, things like that. That there's no official canon or stance on that one. But if it is a maker deity, that does explain why it is everywhere and why everything is subject to it. Everything. I hope I'm making sense. So, but Orleg is what we bring into the table, what we bring into this life, and how we Ort is how we manage it within ourselves, and how we interface with the cosmos around us, and the forces that bind us all together, tear us all apart, etc.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And kind of on that note, what is kind of the interaction or relationship between Vort and what we think of as magic from your perspective?
There's I think we're all going to have somewhat similar, somewhat different perspectives here, but for me, I mean, life is magic. I mean, no matter what we do, we end up thinking thoughts or doing things that are going to influence the world around us. Even if it's something as simple as wishing something were different, and then all of a sudden it becomes different. Some of it sometimes is conscious application, which the conscious application is obviously more what people would consider magic, the intention. But our relationship, what we do, the things we put out there, the things that we affect and impact, is us playing our board, is us influencing the world around us and managing our board. Sometimes the best thing that somebody can do is curse something into non-existence or something away from something, because that's doing a greater good. I'm going to give you a little trick from Braucheri and Hexeri here that, Hexeri will flat out curse things. Many times Braucheri will bless things to speed up the comeback to them. Like if somebody's doing something awful, they'll bless their actions until their reward payback hits them. So it's
Hmm.
still kind of cursing, but it's cursing by a blessing. It's sort of like
Hmm.
it's sort of like the white lie equivalent, the equivalent of a white lie blessing packet. But
Yeah, I mean, and we also talk about too in Braucheri and Hexeri that you know, Rob had mentioned sort of like the unconscious magic work, and how our energies pervade the universe whether we know it or not. And we talk about sometimes, like a perfect example is if a woman found herself infertile but was invited to a baby shower, her emotions around that baby shower could be such that the present she gives, that energy gets transferred to that gift and then is given to the mother to be, and those energies are transferred. And it's better for a proxy to give the gift rather than the infertile woman, so that those feelings of jealousy and resentment don't get passed on with the gift. So those are the sorts of things that they come from Braucheri and Hexeri, but that's the sort of thing that transfers over into our context and understandings and concepts within Urglaawe, about how, magic and energy is all around us, and to live deliberately every day, and to recognize, we use that term a lot, living deliberately, and recognize that, all of our actions have reactions and consequences. So, um, it's all around us all the time, and it's just a matter of being aware of what you do and how you do it.
and
This
Michelle,
actually, oh,
go
go
ahead, Stacey.
ahead.
I'll come
Well,
back.
I was going to say this. Well, this actually tied into the other question about the sacred duty. This is uh, the relationship, not just with other people. That we're concentrating on other people right now, but with animals and minerals and plants and everything on the earth. But being aware that you have those subconscious or unconscious types of energies that might happen. This, I've this is the only place I've experienced someone or someone's giving that example of, I don't, you shouldn't want to do that because, and having this kind of back door to be able to still give without, having the negative things happen. And a part of our purpose here is to continue to evolve in a positive way so that, we might end up after all these lifetimes reaching where the gods were when they were brought into this world, when they spent their time here. So that's what we're trying to move towards as individuals, as a group. And so we're very careful, we try to be very careful of our interactions and actions and stuff like that.
Stacey just hit upon some very important things. One thing I'm going to say is that also this is also you had asked about one of the differences between our distinct. It may be a distinction because I won't say that other heathens don't do this, but we actually have some verboten on our verboten are things that are like taboos coming from Brahma and
Mm.
Heathenry about giving gifts in certain modes. Okay, like Michelle's example is an infertile one. I'm going to use an example of a woman who recently had a miscarriage, and then but her friend, like the two of them were pregnant at the same time. They were looking forward to their babies being friends, and growing up, like almost as siblings. Um, and then when one woman has a miscarriage, there is almost no way that she's not, as much as she may love the other woman and wish the best consciously, something within her is very likely to be jealous or upset or and so we actually have there's actually things in our culture that say you cannot give. So while the heathen mantra is usually a gift for a gift demands a gift, the gift demands a gift in this case has to go through another party because otherwise you're accidentally potentially giving an accidental curse. And so there are times where giving a gift is actually inappropriate in our cultural perspective. And the other thing that Stacey just mentioned, that I want to make sure we draw attention to is the um the whole concept of being at the end of this cosmic cycle where the deities were at the beginning of it. That's kind of the purpose of life, and is to the advancement of the human life way. And now this is where I'm going to become politically incorrect, because much at least a few billion people in this world are adherents to religions that are actively telling people not to expand their conscience, not to question things, just to submit and obey to whatever is written in this book. And that makes them agents of chaos. That actually makes them those religious identities and the opponents to the gods who are trying to get us to expand our minds and our consciousness and to elevate the human life way rather than subdue it. And so, I harbor no ill will towards adherents of other religions unless they harbor ill will toward me. But I do think that those religions are themselves flawed. So, and that's the criticism of the tenets, not of the people.
Just, I thought that was a really interesting point. I would love if you could just expand slightly, how those religions and maybe the distortion put upon them, how that makes agents specifically of chaos. I thought that was an interesting term you're bringing up there.
Because if they're causing backsliding in the human advancement and the human ability to understand the universe, the cosmos around us, our pursuits of science, our pursuits of explanations of who we are, where we came from, where we're going, and thinking outside of what's in those pages of the book, that's not helping us advance. And if we're not advancing, then we are, and the deities and our deities' goal is for us to be advancing until we are at the point where they are. We are backsliding,
And
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 Got it.
and
yeah,
specifically in some cases there are sects that, very specifically their main purpose is to get to the end of times. And, you know, everything that goes with
Mhm.
that, obviously it's about, you know, causing war and famine and all of those things that would lead to ultimate destruction of the human race. That's not what our gods want. So it's just hard to believe that would be anything that that could serve a purpose for the greater good of any person or entity.
Group of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the same thing with human dignity. I mean, like we're now seeing how many of these large religions have reversed women's rights and gay rights and LGBTQ of all across the board, or rights of minorities of one distinction or another based on some discriminatory policy in some book somewhere. That is definitely hampering the advancement of the human life wave and turning back the clock. We're like, we're all panicking about how we could lose our religious rights. Like we should not be at this stage anymore. We should be so far beyond that, but we're backtracking.
I mean, as humanity, we're back. We fought wars. Like you just said that we've already fought these wars. Why are we still fighting them? Or not still. Well, we are still. Why are we fighting the bigger ones again?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Terrifying shit. Weird
Yeah,
times.
definitely.
Just to backtrack slightly, because I am interested. When you were talking about Vert, you mentioned potentially seeing Vert as kind of its own deity form, an origin of sorts. Is that related to Vort Hexa, or is that a separate thing?
The Vort Hexa are equivalent of the Norse Norns.
Yeah.
We have a slightly different perspective on some of this stuff.
Okay.
I believe that they manage the output from Vort from this potential. I don't want to say a godhead because it's not a godhead the same way as Hinduism might have. It may just be. It could be whatever set the Big Bang it could be whatever started the creation of the multiverse. But the Vort Hexa are the kind of the managers of it. Now we have a little bit of a different take. Like in Norse lore, they mentioned 3 of them, and now we're gonna get into psycholinguistics here, all right? Because their belief in hexerai and among some Braukers, as particularly syncretic Braukers who and allow for multiple a lot of these kinds of spiritual things, is that there is at least one vortex who oversees each verb tense. So any verb tense that any language has a vortex that manages that whole time slot. Because we tend to look at past, present, and future, but there's also past perfect, future perfect, all these things like that. How do we the things that are managed from the past into the present, the things that started back then and continue now and are going to go into the future, and how we see that and understand that. I think this is a metaphor mostly, but the metaphor takes into account that not everything is simply relegated to past, present, and future. It points out the far more complicated aspects of existence, of things happening back then and happening again now, happening in the future, and things that started back then and continue, things that start today and continue in the future, and also the more magical things that are starting today, but we're going back into the past and fixing. Um, you know, uh, one of the people said, "Well, you can't fix the past because the past is, it's prologue, it's over." Okay, but the only thing is that I will also say is that one of the simple the truth can also be a great magical tool. If you ever been upset with somebody for years about something that they did, and you suddenly learn from somebody else or something else presents itself that that's not what happened. They were actually trying to do this. You miss that. All of a sudden, all that entire timeline changes because of the information you have. And and you know that so those who believe we can step out of linear time and actually repair these things, especially when you're doing soul work or things like that, which is Brockerai and a Hexerai thing. Um, time is linear time is what we're relegated to as physical beings, but time is far more complicated, far more interesting, far more exciting than that, and also far more confusing. And it is. It can be very disorienting, especially if you're pulled into a future that may or may not exist, but at least on linear times channels. So the word hexa, to me, if they're not literal beings, they are metaphoric beings who represent these verb tenses or these time constructs that cross all these and bring together all these different ideations. So the goddess of the past, present tense, the things that were, but that are the things that were, but kind of continued or finished recently, things like that. Okay, I hope I'm making sense because I don't think I've ever talked about this before in this.
I love it.
Not in this context,
Not
no.
in this context. No, we talk about that in the context of the runes. So, all right, Michelle, do you have something to add?
No, I mean, you covered it. I mean, we talk about, you know, the universe is a spider web sometimes, and the vert hexa, you know, like Rob said, they sort of manage the time, and I sort of see it in that analogy as they're managing the strands, right? So
Mm.
as you exist on the spider web, you can even be just sitting still, but just your vibration causes a ripple across the spider web.
Hmm.
And if a strand gets broken that needed to stay in place, that's sort of where the vertexa come in and repair that strand or to redirect it. And, you know, to Rob's point, that can happen anywhere on the web. And if you had just come from a location, that's your past. But obviously you're still on that line, so it continues through. Um, and the ripple there is felt further out on the spider web. And to me, the spider web itself can represent vert because it is its own entity. So it exists solely as its own thing, but is still controlled by and um, exists because of its individual strands, if that makes sense. Again, I'm probably babbling too, but it's a hard concept to
Oh,
explain.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I can see it very well in my head, just like probably Rob and Stacey can see it in their head. And maybe maybe we're explaining it okay that you can see it, but it's just it's an interesting thing to consider. But like Rob said, once you start getting into all these different times and tenses, it can be mind blowing. And then you start talking about like the multiverse, right? And in the analogy of the spider web, if you think about ever seeing a spider web in a corner, it's almost 3D, and it's sort of that same, you know, it's not linear. There's all different levels, and you know, it's pretty amazing actually to think about.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think we're gonna get even more into that multidimensional element when we start talking about the world tree here in a sec. But one more question before we go to the Patreon segment. I'm just kind of curious, in Urglaawe, how you approach runes in a way that goes beyond divination.
Some of this we have to be careful about because we're currently writing a book.
Oh,
So,
okay, fair enough.
so, um, so we don't want to, we can't give away certain things until we know what we're actually be saying in the book.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I'm gonna preface this by saying I don't think that some of the stuff in Brauerei that I've come across related to runes is ancient. I think it's probably during like the romantic, the German romanticization period, probably in the late 1800s, probably led somebody to investigate this stuff. So I look at some of this stuff probably being maybe 150 years old or so. So, but
So having said that, there are certain runes that absolutely came over before that. The what we call a hexafus is one of them, and there are a couple.
like
But
we found runes etched in granaries that and on looms and things like that. So
yeah,
and also at the base of some hex signs, the geometry, the sacred geometry.
hmm
Even a lot of of non-heathen practitioners recognize that there are probably some runic base to that. But specifically the healing aspect of it, which came across from some Brauerei and Hexerei practitioners, small, very small sample. I can't remember the sample numbers offhand now, but um,
I want to say 36 and then 19,
something
and
like that.
then yeah.
Remember, because I remember that after, but once we closed the door and that somebody else showed up. Um, but but so there was a connection among most of them. Like somebody, they might have had a common mentor, but the runic alphabet was not complete. At least not for the symbols. Everybody knew that there was a sound for that there had to be a rune for P or BB, which makes a sound without aspiration in Pennsylvania Dutch, but nobody had a name for it or a symbol. So we had like this. Some of this we had to do some reconstruction to, but there are um there are more elements in our full concept than just the four that people consider. We had 12 elements, and each element had a proactive and a reactive um, aspect to it. And how you use the runes uh, with one element's proactive versus against another rune's an excess of another rune's uh, excessive reactive things plays a
I used a bind rune that I created for myself about 2 weeks ago when I passed a kidney stone, so it
Oh
it
boy.
definitely helps.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is the part that, like, I got a fairly good list from people the people who had known some of this stuff, and we were able to expound upon our own practice. And and many of these hexerai practitioners don't want to be known because, like, first off, they were very elderly, and the tradition in Braucherei and hexerai, but especially hexerai, was to remain underground. And in order for me to get to interview some of these people, I had to show up with I had to show up with a voucher, like a literal slip of paper from somebody that they knew that had put a special, like, signed it a special way or a special mark on there. If I didn't have that paper, they would refuse to talk to me,
Huh.
because quite honestly, many of these people in the early 2000s, they were like 100 years old, 90 years old, and they had gone through their life keeping this underground because they were afraid of getting harassed. And
Huh.
and so and this is it's a very real thing, especially with the generation of people who were born, from 1900 to onward, because of the anti-German sentiment that had run through the country prior to World War One and into World War Two. Actually, prior to World War One was actually worse, and the 1920s and 1930s were actually worse than World War Two. Um, and so that whole system, we're kind of breaking the mold there by being so open about it. But so the runes we do use, and our rituals we use them because we look for runic energies to manifest in people while we're concentrating and meditating during our rituals. And sometimes we see the same runes, sometimes they shift. But Michelle and I are the primary rune readers. Stacey's done it too, but we're the primary rune readers during the rituals. And we're trying to train more of our people to be able to see it. And oftentimes
Oh,
you get a
can
reading
we
on somebody. Go ahead.
we gotta put in you gotta talk about the computer, how it
Oh,
allowed during
during
COVID, right?
COVID.
We
Yeah.
were not in the same area, we couldn't really practice together. That actually started them for I haven't done a computer one. That started them being able to see colors and movement.
And it was
And
like
yeah.
something about the circuitry enhanced the runic energy coming through. And in order for us to pass the runes back, Hexerai has a process for dealing with this stuff that actually kind of works. You just have to make sure you have enough of a energy resource near you to be able to tap into in order to send it back through the computer channel. Um, but I got pretty good at that over time.
Yeah.
When I first tried it, I was like, I don't even know if this is working.
Cyber runes. That's
Well,
crazy.
but it's still the same runes. It's just, but if you think about it, they're going through all sorts of
Yeah.
transformers and and all
Huh.
all sorts of capacitors and motherboard circuitry that we don't really know that it's coming to us crystal clear, but it seems to be working. So
Huh. That's a trip. I love that. That's wild. Well, I'm excited to see where that book takes you guys. That'll be really cool.
yeah, we are too.
That's what we're working on right now.
Nice. I
And by
love it.
working on, Stacey means she's going back and editing stuff that we wrote a long time ago because I'm too busy working. But
That's why you have a team. I love it. That's great.
Exactly.
Well, I want to take you into a Patreon segment here, but before I do that, if you just want to give any plugs, where people can find you, what you have going on besides this new book. Yeah, there you go. Buy the book.
um,
You can find us on Facebook. Obviously, we have our main Urglaawe group. There's also an Urglaawe page. Um, Rob, Stacey, and I belong to Distelfink Sipshaft, which is sort of the, I guess, for lack of a better word, mother kindred for Urglaawe. It's based in the greater Philadelphia region with members in Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and Maryland. Most of our rituals are held in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. So people can find the Distelfink kindred page. It's actually listed under Die Urglaawisch Sipschaft vom Distelfink.
is there a way? Is there a text? Is there a chat on here? Yeah,
There is.
there it is.
Yeah.
If I type it, will people be able to see it in the recording?
We didn't be able to hit a question though on
Oh, yeah.
hex signs, but I have them on my blog and I can drop you a
Cool.
link to the blog because
Yeah,
I
just
have
send
at
me
least,
links. I'll put them in the show notes.
yeah, I'll throw the links to you.
And I was just gonna prop Stacey because Stacey won't prop herself, but she's got her own page, the Accidental Urglaawe, and shop. I don't remember if you're on Etsy or Shopify, which one it is.
It's on my website actually.
And type it in the chat too.
I see. How can I do
and
this?
also
Oh, I
it's
see.
in the lower right hand corner. And also, we're very heavily involved in Heathens Against Hate.
Yes.
And the new Pennsylvania Dutch banner for that is going to be coming up soon, right, Stacey?
And you'll
Yes.
find us at the majority of regional pagan pride days as well.
Right there. And we have Chicago has a significant rising population of Urglaawe. It's that's where Patricia Niedrich was from, and the National Urglaawe Organization. Its head the president's located. Matt Williams is out there, and so
Oh,
we have
that's.
as in many in
Why did
increasing.
I do it that way?
I don't know what you do.
I did something wrong.
Oh, you put your
I
email address.
mixed my email and my website.
Just email it to me afterwards. It'll be easier.
Okay. Yeah, I can't do this on my iPad.
And then there's a Freundschaft out in the Pacific Northwest. I think that's probably the next most active. And then there's smaller Freundschafts in the southern Indiana. Actually,
They're rising too. Yeah.
northern Indiana area. There's a small group in like the Erie, Pennsylvania area. So like there's some groups that are starting to form and really get active. So
And we have Justin down in
Arkansas.
Missouri, that Water Dutch area. The we're all getting busy. We're getting all sorts of dings. Well, there was something else I was going to say. What else we got coming up? So, well, let's see. On the 18th of April is
Book signing.
that's Celtic Myth and Moonlight in West Reading. That's where we're going there. West Reading, Pennsylvania. We're going to a book signing there at Celtic Myth and Moonlight in West Reading, Pennsylvania. Then I know we have that one in I just forgot when the date is. I'm getting all my months confused.
28th? No, it was the 18th of the next month, wasn't
No,
it?
but no, it's not May 18th. It's when's the Appalachian Conjure?
That's July 18th.
July 18th. That just came up on our schedule. That's up in Andreas, Pennsylvania, and Poconos, which is near the Urglaawe graveyard. And we'll have that on our site too. And what else we have going on? All the pagan pride days. A lot of them here, at least in the Mid-Atlantic. And we have monthly pub moots in Bristol, Pennsylvania. That is a good way for people to come in and get to know us if they're able to get here in person. Anything else? And sure, we're around a lot, just not.
I love it. That's great. Yeah, I'll put a bunch of links in the show notes so people can find y'all. That's great. Now we're magically on a different podcast. This is the Patreon segment. Can you believe it?
I know.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing.
Step away real quick.
I know. Like
For
magic.
break. I will be right back.
Mark
You can
calls
start
me
with
the
that one.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no worries. I think I'm going to throw a question to you, Stacey, because you actually brought it up. Hex signs. We didn't get into hex signs. Can you talk a little bit about hex signs and how you use them in Urglaawe?